He left the country chasing success, and came back to a ranch where 3 little girls with his eyes were waiting for him. Daniel Wright had always believed that leaving was the same as moving forward. Opportunity rarely waited, and when it did appear, it demanded speed, focus, and sacrifice. Standing in the departure hall with his passport in hand, he told himself that this trip was temporary, that success now would mean stability later, that everything else could wait. That was how he justified the knot in his chest as he glanced back one last time. Hannah Miller stood a few steps behind him, trying to memorize the shape of his shoulders, the familiar line of his profile, the way his brown hair fell slightly over his forehead when he was tired. She smiled when he looked at her, because smiling was easier than explaining what she was feeling. Easier than admitting that something inside her was screaming for him to stay. "You'll be back before you know it," Daniel said, confident and reassuring, as if repeating the words could make them true. His blue eyes were bright with ambition, already focused on a future that stretched far beyond this airport. Hannah nodded. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to say so many things that pressed against her ribs, but fear kept them trapped there. Fear of being inconvenient. Fear of being the reason he hesitated. Fear that if she spoke now, she would hear the answer she was most afraid of. "I know," she replied quietly. They hugged, brief and careful, the kind of embrace people share when they assume time will give them endless chances later. Daniel picked up his bag and turned toward the gate without looking back again. Hannah watched until he disappeared into the crowd, then stayed standing long after she should have left, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. 2 weeks later, the world shifted. Hannah sat alone in her bathroom, staring at the test in her trembling hands as if it might change its mind if she waited long enough. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the lights overhead. When the reality finally settled in, it didn't arrive as panic, but as a heavy, grounding certainty. Pregnant. Her first instinct was to call Daniel immediately. Her fingers hovered over his name on her phone, heart racing as she imagined his voice, his reaction, the long pause before he spoke. She pictured him in a foreign city, surrounded by meetings and unfamiliar streets, building something he had chased for years. The image made her chest tighten. She didn't call. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, one hand resting on her stomach as if the gesture alone could protect what was growing inside her. Questions crowded her mind, each one heavier than the last. How would she tell him? When would be the right time? What if he thought she was trying to stop him from becoming the man he wanted to be? Days passed, and then weeks. Hannah moved through them carefully, hiding her nausea, forcing herself through work, smiling when people spoke about plans and futures she could no longer imagine clearly. She wrote messages to Daniel and erased them before sending, convinced that there would be a better moment, a clearer way to say it. There never was. By the time she finally accepted that the truth could no longer be delayed, Daniel was already deeply embedded in his new life abroad. His messages were shorter now, filled with updates about deals and deadlines, optimism and exhaustion. Hannah read them all, replying with encouragement she didn't entirely feel. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself she was protecting the child. She told herself many things. What she didn't know yet was that silence, once chosen, has a way of shaping entire lives. And that the man who had left believing he was chasing success would one day return to find that the most important part of his life had grown without him. The confirmation came on a quiet morning when Hannah finally gathered the courage to sit in a small clinic far from the noise of the city. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender, a strange combination meant to calm nerves, though it did little to slow the pounding of her heart. She watched the technician move with practiced ease, her eyes fixed on the screen as if searching for the right words before speaking them aloud. When the doctor entered and studied the results, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He asked Hannah a few routine questions, then adjusted his glasses and smiled in a way that was both professional and gentle. "Well," he said, pausing just long enough to make her stomach drop, "it appears you're not expecting just one baby." Hannah blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry." "Triplets," he repeated. "3." The word echoed in her mind, expanding until it filled every corner of her thoughts. 3 babies. 3 heartbeats. 3 lives growing quietly inside her while the man who had helped create them stood thousands of miles away, unaware. The enormity of it made her dizzy, and she gripped the edge of the chair to steady herself as the doctor continued speaking, explaining risks, monitoring plans, and the need for frequent checkups. She nodded at the appropriate moments, absorbing only fragments of information. The reality settled in slowly, like a weight that could not be shrugged off. When the appointment ended, Hannah stepped outside into the bright daylight, the world continuing on exactly as it had before, indifferent to the fact that everything for her had just changed. She sat in her car for nearly an hour before turning the key, her mind racing with questions that had no clear answers. How could she possibly manage 3 babies alone? Where would she live? How would she work? And, inevitably, how would she tell Daniel? That evening, she opened her laptop and began researching obsessively. Articles about multiple pregnancies filled the screen, each one more overwhelming than the last. Risks, expenses, sleepless nights, emotional strain. Every paragraph added another layer of fear, but beneath it all, something else began to take root. A fierce sense of responsibility, sharp and unyielding. She tried to call Daniel that night. The phone rang twice before she ended the call, her hand shaking. She imagined his face when she told him, the way his jaw would tighten as he processed the news, the calculations that would inevitably follow. She knew him too well. He would return, not out of joy, but obligation. And the thought of that hurt more than being alone. Days turned into weeks as her body began to change more noticeably. The nausea intensified, exhaustion settled deep into her bones, and even simple tasks left her breathless. Friends commented on how pale she looked, how tired she seemed. Hannah brushed it off with vague excuses, guarding her secret with a mixture of fear and determination. At night, she lay awake with her hands resting on her stomach, speaking softly into the darkness as if the babies could already hear her. She told them they were wanted. She told them she would do everything she could to protect them. She promised them a life filled with honesty, even if it meant sacrifice. As the months progressed, Hannah made decisions she never thought she would face alone. She moved into a smaller apartment closer to medical facilities, cut unnecessary expenses, and quietly began saving every dollar she could. She sold pieces of her past without sentiment, understanding that the future demanded room to grow. She drafted messages to Daniel countless times, each one starting strong and ending unfinished. Some were practical, others emotional, a few angry. None of them felt right. The distance between them grew not in miles, but in silence, and Hannah wondered if she was building a wall she would one day regret. Still, she waited. She told herself she would speak when she was stronger, when she had answers, when she could stand on her own without needing anything from him. She convinced herself that independence was protection, that if she could face this alone, she could face anything. What she didn't realize yet was that by choosing silence, she was also choosing a future shaped entirely by that choice. And once the path was set, turning back would no longer be simple. The pregnancy progressed with a rhythm that was both relentless and unpredictable, each week bringing new challenges Hannah could never have prepared for. Carrying 3 children demanded more from her body than she thought possible, and there were mornings when simply getting out of bed felt like an accomplishment. Her doctor monitored her closely, adjusting appointments and schedules as the strain became more apparent, gently reminding her that rest was no longer a suggestion but a necessity. Hannah tried to follow the advice, but rest came with its own kind of fear. Stillness gave her mind too much space to wander, and in that silence questions returned with sharp persistence. She thought about Daniel often, not with anger, but with a quiet ache that settled deep in her chest. She wondered what he was doing at that exact moment, whether he ever thought of her, whether he would even recognize the life growing without him if he saw it now. Her body changed rapidly. The curve of her stomach became impossible to hide, and strangers began offering unsolicited advice in grocery store aisles and waiting rooms. Some smiled kindly, others stared openly, clearly trying to calculate how one woman could possibly be carrying so much. Hannah learned to keep her answers brief and her smile polite, protecting her story from curiosity she did not have the energy to satisfy. The complications began subtly. Swelling that didn't go down. Sharp pains that came and went without warning. One night, the discomfort became intense enough that she found herself in the emergency room, sitting under harsh fluorescent lights while nurses moved quickly around her. The babies were fine, she was told, but the message was clear. Her body was under stress, and the months ahead would not be easy. She was placed on partial bed rest soon after. That decision forced another reckoning. Hannah took a leave from work earlier than planned, watching her financial stability grow more fragile by the day. She created spreadsheets, calculated expenses down to the smallest detail, and still the numbers never truly worked. Fear sat beside her like an unwelcome companion, but she refused to let it take control. During long afternoons alone in her apartment, Hannah began writing letters. Not emails. Not messages meant to be sent. Real letters, written by hand in a notebook she kept hidden in a drawer. She wrote to Daniel about the doctor visits, about the baby's heartbeats, about how she felt them move differently, each one already distinct in ways she could sense but not explain. She wrote about her fear and her resolve, about the nights she cried quietly and the mornings she woke up determined to keep going. She never mailed a single one. As the due date approached, the reality of childbirth loomed large and terrifying. The doctors explained the risks calmly, outlining plans and contingencies with professional detachment. Hannah listened carefully, asking questions, memorizing instructions, preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. Still, when she lay awake at night, imagining the delivery room and the uncertainty it held, fear wrapped around her chest until breathing felt difficult. The call came earlier than expected. Late one evening, pain spread across her abdomen in waves that did not fade. Hannah knew instinctively that this was not something she could wait out. She grabbed her bag, already packed for weeks, and called a neighbor to drive her to the hospital. As the car moved through dark streets, rain streaking the windows, she pressed a hand to her stomach and whispered reassurance to the babies, her voice trembling but steady. The delivery was long and exhausting, filled with instructions shouted over the steady rhythm of medical equipment. Hannah drifted in and out of awareness, clinging to the sound of her own breathing as her body gave everything it had left. When the first cry rang out, sharp and insistent, tears streamed down her face without permission. Two more followed soon after, overlapping and urgent, filling the room with life. 3 girls. Emma. Lily. Grace. They were placed briefly against her chest one by one, small and warm and impossibly real. Hannah's exhaustion melted into something fierce and protective, a love so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. In that moment, the fear receded, replaced by certainty. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it for them. Later, alone in the quiet of the recovery room, Hannah stared at her daughters sleeping in their bassinets, their tiny faces nearly identical, their breaths shallow and even. She felt an ache for Daniel then, sharper than before, but it no longer held the same power. He was a part of their story, but not the center of it. She had crossed a threshold that night. From that moment on, Hannah was no longer waiting for someone to return. She was moving forward, carrying 3 new lives with her into a future that would demand everything she had, and more. The years that followed blurred together into a rhythm Hannah never could have imagined before motherhood claimed every corner of her life. Life on the ranch was demanding in ways that city living had never prepared her for, yet it gave her something solid to lean on when everything else felt fragile. The house had creaked at night, the wind had rattled the windows, and the mornings had arrived early whether she was ready or not. Still, there was space there, and silence, and honesty in the work that grounded her. Emma, Lily, and Grace grew quickly, 3 identical girls with bright blue eyes and brown hair that refused to stay neat no matter how carefully Hannah brushed it. They followed her everywhere, tiny shadows with endless questions and boundless energy. Hannah learned how to function on little sleep, how to carry 2 children while the third clung to her leg, how to laugh even when her body ached and her patience wore thin. The ranch demanded the same resilience. Animals needed feeding, fences needed repair, and the land did not care whether she was tired or afraid. There were moments when loneliness pressed in hard, especially in the evenings when the girls were finally asleep and the house fell quiet. Hannah would sit on the porch, watching the sky stretch wide above the fields, wondering if Daniel ever thought about the life he had left behind. She did not regret her choice, but she felt the weight of it. Raising 3 children alone left little room for doubt, yet doubt sometimes found her anyway. The girls turned 4 in a blur of scraped knees, birthday candles, and laughter that echoed across the open land. They loved the ranch with the kind of devotion only children could give, running barefoot through the grass, chasing chickens, and wearing their small cowboy hats with exaggerated seriousness. Hannah watched them grow into themselves, each with subtle differences she knew by heart even if others struggled to tell them apart. It was on an ordinary afternoon that everything changed. Daniel had returned to the country quietly, without announcements or celebrations. Success had followed him overseas, but it had not brought the satisfaction he expected. The deals were complete, the money secured, yet something felt unfinished. On impulse more than intention, he decided to drive beyond the city limits, letting unfamiliar roads guide him somewhere quieter. He did not recognize the ranch at first. The land looked different, more alive, filled with movement and sound. He slowed the car when he saw 3 small figures running across the yard, their laughter drifting through the open air. They wore cowboy hats too big for their heads, chasing each other in a game only they understood. Then he saw Hannah. She stood near the fence, watching them with a smile that held exhaustion and pride in equal measure. Time seemed to collapse in on itself. Daniel pulled the car over without fully understanding why his hands were shaking. He stepped out slowly, his heart pounding as he took in the scene before him. The girls stopped running when they noticed him, curiosity replacing laughter as they studied the stranger. Daniel's breath caught painfully in his chest when he saw their faces clearly. The resemblance was undeniable. The same blue eyes stared back at him, wide and unafraid. The same expression he had seen in his reflection for years. His certainty faltered, replaced by a realization so heavy it made his legs feel weak. Hannah turned at the sound of the car door closing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years between them stretched wide and unspoken, filled with choices that could not be undone. Hannah's expression shifted from surprise to understanding, and then to calm resolve. "Daniel," she said quietly. The girls looked up at her at the sound of his name, then back at him, sensing the importance of the moment even if they did not yet understand it. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, words failing him for the first time in his life. He looked from Hannah to the girls, his mind racing through memories and timelines, each one confirming what his heart already knew. Are they? He began, his voice barely steady. Hannah did not rush to answer. She rested a hand on the fence, grounding herself before meeting his gaze. Therefore, she said calmly. And yes. They're yours. The world did not shatter. It went completely still. Daniel stood there, staring at the three little girls who had grown into existence without him, the weight of what he had missed settling heavily on his shoulders. The ranch, the land, the life Hannah had built all stood as quiet proof of years he could never reclaim. And in that stillness, he understood with absolute clarity that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Daniel did not remember how long he stood there after Hannah spoke. Time seemed to lose its meaning as the reality of her words settled into him layer by layer, each one heavier than the last. 3 daughters. 4 years old. His daughters. The truth pressed against his chest until breathing felt difficult, and for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he had no response prepared. The girls broke the silence before he could. Mom, one of them asked, tugging lightly at Hannah's hand. Who is he? Hannah lowered her gaze to them, her expression gentle but firm, the way it had become over years of answering hard questions with honesty suited to a child's world. This is Daniel, she said simply. He's someone important. Daniel flinched at the restraint in her words. Important, but not named. Not defined. He understood immediately that this was intentional, a boundary drawn not in anger, but in protection. The girls studied him openly now, their identical faces tilted in curiosity. One adjusted her cowboy hat with exaggerated seriousness, another squinted slightly as if trying to see something deeper than his appearance, and the third smiled at him without hesitation, as if sensing no danger at all. Daniel felt something tighten painfully in his throat. They look just like you, he said quietly, the observation slipping out before he could stop himself. Hannah nodded. I know. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions at once. Why she hadn't told him. How she had managed alone. What their names were. What they liked, what scared them, what he had missed. But the weight of all that unspoken time held him still, afraid that one wrong word would shatter the fragile moment. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice rough. I swear to you, I didn't know. Hannah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I believe you, she said at last. But belief doesn't change the past. The truth of that landed harder than accusation ever could. The girls grew restless, the intensity of the moment stretching beyond their patience. One ran off toward the barn, calling for the others, and soon all 3 were laughing again, their attention shifting effortlessly back to their world. Daniel watched them go, his chest aching with the realization that their laughter did not include him, that their lives had formed without his presence. Can we talk? He asked quietly. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. She led him a short distance away, far enough that the girls could not hear but close enough to keep them in sight. The ranch stretched around them, wide and open, leaving no place for words to hide. I went looking for you, Daniel said, the confession spilling out now that it had begun. When I came back, I thought. I don't know what I thought. I just didn't expect this. I didn't expect it either, Hannah replied calmly. Not at first. And then I stopped expecting anything from you at all. Daniel lowered his gaze, shame settling deep in his chest. Why didn't you call? Email? Anything? I did, she said quietly. At least, I tried. And then I stopped, because you were building a life, and I didn't want to be the reason you came back out of obligation instead of choice. He looked at her sharply. You should have given me the choice. I made one, she answered. For them. Silence fell between them again, thicker this time, filled with everything they could not undo. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, struggling to reconcile the man he had been with the one standing here now. "What happens now?" he asked. Hannah's voice did not waver. "That depends on you. This isn't about money or apologies. It's about consistency. About whether you show up tomorrow. And the day after that." "I will," he said immediately. Too quickly. Hannah met his eyes, unflinching. "Words are easy. They always have been." He swallowed hard, understanding the weight of her skepticism. "Tell me their names," he said softly. "Please." For the first time since he arrived, Hannah's expression softened just slightly. "Emma," she said, pointing toward the barn. "Lily. And Grace." Daniel repeated the names under his breath, as if committing them to memory could somehow make up for lost time. Emma. Lily. Grace. 3 lives that had grown without him, 3 chances he had never known he was missing. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, Daniel felt the certainty of his old world crumble completely. There were no contracts here, no negotiations, no guarantees. Only a woman who had learned to survive without him and 3 little girls who owed him nothing. And for the first time, Daniel understood that if he wanted a place in this life, he would have to earn it one quiet, ordinary day at a time. Daniel began coming back the very next morning, not because he thought it would earn him forgiveness, but because Hannah's words had settled into him with uncomfortable clarity. Consistency was not a promise, it was a pattern, and patterns were built quietly, day by day. He arrived early, before the girls woke, parking his car at the edge of the property as if unsure whether he truly belonged there yet. At first, Hannah kept their interactions practical. She did not invite him inside. She did not offer coffee. She acknowledged his presence with a nod and continued her routines, moving through the morning with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to rely on help. Daniel noticed everything. The way she planned each task around the girls' needs, the way she anticipated problems before they appeared, the way exhaustion lived just beneath her calm expression. The girls were wary but curious. Emma was the boldest, watching him closely and asking direct questions without hesitation. Lily lingered near Hannah, observing quietly, absorbing more than she revealed. Grace was the most unpredictable, alternating between shy distance and sudden bursts of laughter that caught Daniel off guard. He learned quickly that each of them was different in ways that mattered deeply, even if the world insisted on seeing them as identical. Daniel did not push. He followed Hannah's lead, offering help only when asked. He fixed a loose fence post under her supervision, carried feed bags without complaint, and listened more than he spoke. He discovered that silence could be more honest than explanations, and that showing up without demands was harder than any negotiation he had ever handled. One afternoon, Hannah handed him a small task without looking at him. "Can you watch them for a few minutes while I check the horses?" Daniel nodded, his chest tightening with the weight of the responsibility. He sat on the grass as the girls played nearby, unsure how to position himself in their world. Emma approached first, holding out a stick with solemn seriousness. "This is a sword," she announced. Daniel accepted it carefully. "I see. Is it a strong one?" She nodded, satisfied. "Very." Lily soon joined them, correcting Emma's rules with quiet authority, while Grace climbed into Daniel's lap without warning, startling him so badly he nearly lost his balance. She laughed at his surprise, delighted, and something inside him shifted in response. It was a small moment, ordinary and unremarkable, yet it felt monumental. Hannah watched from a distance, her expression guarded but thoughtful. She did not intervene. She did not smile. But she did not pull the girls away either. As days passed, Daniel adjusted his life around the ranch without announcing the changes to anyone. Meetings were rescheduled. Trips were postponed. His phone buzzed constantly with reminders of the world he had built elsewhere, but for the first time, those demands felt distant and strangely irrelevant. He discovered a different kind of exhaustion here, one that came with dirt under his nails and the steady ache of muscles unused to physical work, and he welcomed it. One evening, as the girls chased fireflies under the fading sky, Daniel stood beside Hannah near the porch. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of grass and dust. "They don't need me," he said quietly, not as a complaint, but as an observation. Hannah nodded. "No. They don't." The honesty stung, but he understood her point. "I want them to want me," he admitted. "That takes time," she replied. "And patience." He glanced at her then, really looking at her, at the strength etched into her posture and the caution in her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just want the chance to be present." She studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against his actions. "Presence isn't something you ask for," she said finally. "It's something you prove." That night, Daniel drove back to the city with the image of 3 small figures waving goodbye burned into his mind. He realized that the hardest part of this journey was not the guilt or the regret, but the discipline of staying when leaving had always been his instinct. And for the first time, he knew he was willing to learn how to stay, even if it took the rest of his life to get it right. Time began to stretch in a new way as Daniel's presence stopped being an interruption and slowly became part of the rhythm of the ranch. He no longer arrived as a guest uncertain of his welcome, but neither was he fully inside their lives. He existed in the fragile space between, where every action mattered and every mistake lingered longer than intended. Hannah noticed the effort it took for him to remain patient, especially on days when the girls tested boundaries the way only 4-year-olds could. The first real fracture came quietly. It was late afternoon when Grace tripped while running across the yard and scraped her knee badly enough that the crying did not stop quickly. Hannah rushed to her side, lifting her instinctively, while Emma and Lily hovered nearby, anxious and confused. Daniel froze for a split second, then moved forward, unsure whether to help or step back. He reached for Grace without thinking, his hands already shaking when Hannah stiffened. "I've got her," Hannah said sharply. The words were not cruel, but they were firm enough to remind him of his place. Daniel stepped back immediately, guilt flushing through him. Grace continued crying, reaching out toward Hannah, not him, and that small rejection hurt more than he expected. Later that evening, after the girls had calmed down and fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone on the porch, staring out at the dark fields. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him. He understood Hannah's reaction logically, but emotionally it stirred a familiar fear, the one that whispered he would always be too late, too distant, too replaceable. Hannah joined him after a while, sitting a careful distance away. "I'm not angry," she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "But I need to know you understand something." "I do," Daniel replied. "They're your priority. Not mine." "They are our priority," she corrected gently. "But I've been the only one carrying that responsibility for 4 years. I can't hand it over just because you want to help." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't want to take it. I just want to share it." Hannah studied him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "Then you need to accept that sometimes I'll pull them back. Not because I don't trust you, but because I'm still learning how to." That honesty steadied him more than reassurance ever could. "I can wait," he said. "I've already waited too long." Days later, another moment tested that resolve. Daniel arrived one morning to find Hannah unusually pale, moving slowly as she prepared breakfast. Emma and Lily were arguing over a toy, while Grace sat quietly at the table, unusually subdued. Hannah brushed it off at first, blaming a sleepless night, but as the hours passed, her hands began to tremble. Daniel noticed immediately. "You need to sit down," he said firmly. "I'm fine," Hannah insisted, but the words lacked conviction. It was Grace who changed everything. She walked over to Hannah, wrapped her arms around her waist, and whispered, "Mommy doesn't feel good." Daniel didn't ask permission this time. He picked up the phone and called the local clinic, explaining the situation calmly and clearly. Hannah protested weakly, but when dizziness forced her to sit, she didn't stop him. The diagnosis was exhaustion and dehydration, nothing dangerous but serious enough to require rest. Daniel stayed without question, managing the girls with awkward determination while Hannah slept for hours uninterrupted for the first time in years. He burned lunch, misread a storybook twice, and tied one ponytail so crooked it made Lily laugh until she cried, but he stayed. When Hannah woke, she found the house chaotic but warm. The girls sprawled on the floor drawing pictures while Daniel sat among them, listening intently as Emma explained an elaborate story only she seemed to fully understand. Something shifted then. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But enough. That night, Hannah stood beside Daniel as the girls brushed their teeth, watching him gently guide Grace's hands without taking over, encouraging instead of correcting. She felt the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly. "You did well today," she said quietly once the girls were asleep. Daniel looked surprised. "I was terrified the entire time." "That's part of it," Hannah replied. They stood together in the quiet afterward, neither rushing to fill the silence. Outside, the wind moved softly through the fields, carrying the distant sound of crickets. Daniel realized that this, not the boardrooms or contracts, was the most fragile and meaningful negotiation he had ever entered. And for the first time since returning, Hannah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this life no longer had to be carried alone. The shift did not arrive with celebration or clear declarations, but with a quiet certainty that settled into their days. Daniel stopped feeling like someone who was visiting and began to feel like someone who belonged, not because Hannah said so, but because the girls acted as if it were already true. They began to look for him in the mornings, asking where he was if his car was not yet visible at the edge of the drive, saving stories from the day to tell him later as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Emma declared one evening that Daniel should read the bedtime story because he does the voices wrong, and that makes it funny. Lily started handing him drawings without explanation, simply placing them in his hands and walking away, trusting that he would understand their importance. Grace began climbing into his lap during quiet moments, curling there as if she had always known it was safe. Hannah watched all of this with a mix of relief and cautious wonder. She had prepared herself to protect her daughters from disappointment, to step in at the first sign of uncertainty, but Daniel remained steady. He missed nothing on purpose. When work pulled at him from afar, he pushed back, choosing early mornings, late nights, and difficult compromises rather than absence. The ranch changed with him. Repairs were finished that had been delayed for years. The old porch was reinforced, the barn door fixed properly instead of temporarily, the fence straightened so the girls could run without Hannah's constant worry. None of it was dramatic, but all of it mattered. It was proof not of money, but of intention. One evening, as the sun set low and painted the fields in gold, Daniel knelt in the grass while the girls played around him. Emma paused suddenly and looked at him with the seriousness only a child could manage. "Are you going to leave again?" she asked. The question landed with a weight Daniel felt in his bones. He did not rush to answer. He met her gaze fully, aware that this was not a moment for comfort, but for truth. "No," he said. "I made a mistake once because I didn't know what I was leaving behind. Now I do." Emma studied him carefully, then nodded as if filing the information away for later. "Okay," she said, satisfied, and ran back to her sisters. Hannah had been watching from the porch. She stepped down into the yard slowly, her voice quiet but steady. "That answer matters," she said. "So does the question," Daniel replied. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, they sat together at the kitchen table, the house finally quiet. The years between them did not disappear, but they no longer felt like a wall. They felt like a foundation built from difficult truths and earned trust. "I didn't plan this life," Hannah said softly. "But I love it. And I won't lose it." "I'm not here to take anything from you," Daniel said. "I want to build onto it, if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face not for promises, but for permanence. When she nodded, it was not dramatic, but it was decisive. The following months passed with a new sense of balance. The girls started school, wearing matching backpacks and waving enthusiastically from the gate. Daniel attended meetings and school events alike, equally attentive to both. Hannah allowed herself rest without guilt, knowing someone else was watching closely. On a clear autumn morning, the five of them stood together near the fence, the land stretching wide before them. The girls wore their cowboy hats again, laughing as the wind tried to steal them away. Daniel stood behind Hannah, not touching her at first, then resting a hand lightly at her back, a question she answered by leaning into the contact. He had once left without knowing what he was leaving behind. Now he stayed, fully aware of everything that mattered. And in the quiet strength of that choice, a family finally stood complete.